Week 8 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first kicker, Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks. Myers, he's been solid for the most part this season. And coming off a nice game at the Falcons, 12 fantasy points. In Week 8, it's going to be a tough matchup, no doubt about it. First, the Buffalo Bills, a bend but don't break defense. So I think Myers, he could get a few field goal opportunities. Seahawks go back home for the 12th man. And this is a big game for Seattle after they dropped 3 in a row, got back to their winning ways in Week 7. And now tough matchup versus Buffalo where they know they got to put points on the board, where Buffalo obviously upgraded their offense, trading for Amari Cooper. So Jason Myers, he's got a good boot. He's been a solid kicker over the last couple seasons. And this year, 4 out of 7 games with double digits, and a kicker there this week available right now in 76% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker is Austin Seibert of the Washington Commanders. So very surprising, still out there in 54% of fantasy leagues. And it's most likely the last chance for fantasy owners to go out there and get Seibert. We're another double-digit fantasy game, and this Commander offense, they're putting up points left and right all season long. So the last 4 games, double-digit games for Seibert. Week 4 at Arizona, 11. Week 5 versus Cleveland, 10. Week 6 at the Ravens, 15. And Week 7, the monster game versus the Panthers, 17 fantasy points. So Week 8, another good matchup versus the Chicago Bears, but a bend but don't break type of defense here is the Chicago team, where they give up a lot of field goals on the year. It's going to be a little bit tougher, I believe, for this Commander team to score points early and often. And like I said, Austin Seibert, he can kick it from anywhere on the field, and he's been a double-digit point machine this season in fantasy football. Out of his 6 games he's played in, double-digit fantasy points. Next kicker, Jake Bates, Detroit Lions. Jake Bates, it's been a solid year for him in one of the more high-powered offenses and one of the better offenses in all of pro football out there right now in 66% of fantasy leagues. In the last couple weeks, he's starting to get it going, his Bates. Week 6 at Dallas, 19. And Week 7 at Minnesota, 8 fantasy points. And Week 8 versus middle-of-the-pack defense, bend but don't break as well. Where Tennessee, besides last week, giving up 34 points, their defense for the most part, teens to the low 20s, they're giving up to the opposing offense. But like I said, this Detroit Lion offense, high-powered. Bates, he's going to get a lot of opportunities all season long to get anywhere from 7+ fantasy points. And right now, while he's out there in 66% of fantasy leagues and one of the better kickers in fantasy this season, he's an ad this week. Next ad, Will Renchard of the Minnesota Vikings. Renchard, it's been a great season for him in his rookie season, and he hasn't missed a field goal all year long, and he's been a long distance kicker as well. Available 90% of fantasy leagues. Another indoor game, Week 8 at the Los Angeles Rams. We know they're vulnerable to giving up points on Thursday night, where those games are usually high scoring and a quick turnaround. So the last 2 weeks, Week 5 versus the Jets, 16 fantasy points. Then they had the bye with Minnesota. And then Week 7, another big performance versus the Lions with 15 fantasy points. So Richard, most of his games indoors, obviously this season, playing at home in Minnesota, where it's an indoor field. Week 8 indoor game at Los Angeles, and it could be possibly a shootout where those Thursday night games are the high scoring. And right now, while he's out there 90% of fantasy leagues and on the season, he's got 4 games to 6 with double-digit fantasy points. Definitely an ad this week. And the final kicker, I looked at off the wires, Will Lutz of the Denver Broncos, and they're going over the last few weeks. The kicker this season, 4 games out of 7 with double-digit fantasy points. So this is a Bronco offense for the most part that stalls out a lot in the red zone, and they got to settle for kicks. And we know Sean Payton's a big fan of Will Lutz. Traded for him before the season last year from New Orleans. He was the head coach with that team, obviously, for many seasons. Will Lutz is the kicker. And Will Lutz, he's gone out there and he's put up good performances. Week 5 versus the Raiders, 13. Week 6 versus the Chargers, 5. And Week 7 at the Saints, 18. So this week, a good matchup versus the Panthers. Give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And right now, well, Lutz is out there in 94% of fantasy leagues. And we know he's got a long-distance boot as well from 50+. Definitely a kicker there this week. So that's a few kickers I looked at off the wire for Week 8 of the fantasy football season.